So, not too long ago, Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, gave a pretty significant speech from the pulpit at Legacy Church over in Albuquerque. What we're going to do here is break down the key arguments he made, just laying out the central themes of his message as neutrally as possible. All right, let's get into it.
He really framed his entire talk around this one core idea, that if you don't have a shared national identity, well, you don't really have a nation. This quote right here, it's the key. It gets right to the heart of his argument, tying together immigration, culture, and the very definition of what it means to be a country.
All right, so here's our roadmap for this. First, we'll set the scene a little bit. Then we'll dig into his ideas on borders, assimilation, and law. From there, we'll get into what he calls the red-green ideological threat. Then his specific call to the church, and we'll wrap up by seeing how he applies this whole worldview to real questions from the audience.
Okay, so first up, setting the scene. And the setting here is really, really important. You got to understand, this wasn't just some political rally. This was a message given to a huge congregation inside a church. So he's blending political talk with, theological arguments.
All right, Section 2. Kirk kicks off his whole argument right at the southern border. For him, you can't even begin to talk about national identity until you talk about physical security, the rule of law, and this big idea of assimilation for anyone who comes into the country.
And, he makes a pretty direct claim here. He says the previous administration wanted the southern border to stay open, along with the flow of drugs and crime that he says comes with it. He then draws a really sharp contrast with the Trump administration, claiming the border was completely secure under them.
So that word assimilation, what does he actually mean by it? Well, Kirk gives a very specific definition. It's not just about, living here. He's talking about a complete adoption of a new national identity. We're talking learning English and being willing to die for the country. It's about ultimate loyalty.
And this line right here, this is pretty much the slogan that sums up his entire viewpoint on the issue. It's a stark, very memorable phrase. For him, the cultural and legal integration of immigrants, it's totally non-negotiable if a nation wants to survive.
Now, remember, he's speaking in a church, so to really ground these political points for his audience, he turns to Scripture. He points to the book of Numbers to argue for, one law for everyone, citizens and immigrants alike. And then he uses Deuteronomy to warn about what he sees as the potential dangers of letting unassimilated people into your nation.
Okay, let's move on to the next major theme. Kirk identifies what he calls a two-pronged ideological attack on America, and he gives it a name. The red-green axis. So let's break that down.
So the red part of that red-green axis, that's what he calls wokeism. He defines it as basically a Marxist tactic. The strategy, as he lays it out, is simple. You just call something racist or unjust over and over again until you get to control it.
Okay, so the green part of the axis, that, in his view, is Islam. He combines these two, Marxism and Islam, into this red-green axis. He's arguing that these two, very different ideologies are actually teaming up. He even calls it a mix of Marxism and Mohammedism.
You might be asking, wait, how would those two groups even work together? Well, according to Kirk, it all comes down to a common enemy. He claims that their shared hatred for the West, and especially for the United States, is the glue that holds this alliance together. It's powerful enough to make them overlook all their other differences.
And to really hammer home what he sees as the threat from Islam, he draws this incredibly stark, direct comparison you see right here. He puts Jesus and Muhammad side by side to argue that they are, in his view, fundamentally and morally complete opposites.
So, okay, after laying out all these problems, Kirk then pivots to his proposed solution. And for him, the solution puts the Christian church right at the center of the fight. His call to action isn't for politicians. It's aimed squarely at believers and at the church itself.
He argues that the battle actually has to start inside the church. He draws this really clear line in the sand between two types of churches. On one side, what he calls a true biblical church, that's all about holiness and truth. And on the other, a woke church that he claims is more interested in making people happy and avoids judging at all costs.
So naturally, this leads to the big question for everyone listening, right? If you're facing all these threats, both outside and inside the church, what are you, as an individual Christian, actually supposed to do about it?
Kirk's answer boils down to a pretty simple four-word command from Jesus' teachings: love God and love people. But, and this is a big but for him, he adds a really important clarification. For him, loving people also means correcting them when you believe they're sinning. It's not just about, accepting whatever they do.
All right, so in the last part of his speech, Kirk takes all these big, abstract ideas and starts applying them to very specific, real-world questions that people in the audience asked him. Everything from education to the economy.
First question up was about education. Somebody in the audience who homeschools their kids wanted to know what to say to people who are against it. And Kirk's answer on this was, well, it was pretty blunt. He basically tells them that those critics can go apply for a job from their homeschooled kids in 10 years. He directly links homeschooling to his whole argument about ideological threats, saying it's the way to raise kids outside of a system he sees as corrupt. In his view, these kids aren't just being homeschooled, they're the wise future leaders who are going to run society. All right, next question. And this one hits home for a lot of young people. It's about the American dream, really. Can Gen Z ever realistically afford to buy a house like their parents and grandparents did?
To really highlight the problem, he throws out one single powerful number, 38. He says that's the average age of a first-time homebuyer in America now, and for him, that number is a clear sign that the economy is broken.
But here's the thing. For Kirk, this isn't just an economic problem. It's a moral one. He pushes back hard against the idea of America becoming a rental society. He argues that what made this country great was people buying land, making it better, and then passing it down to their kids. That act of ownership, he says, is a core part of the American character.
So, when you boil it all down, Kirk's message frames all of these political and cultural debates as, fundamentally, spiritual warfare. And that leaves us with a really big, critical question to think about. When you frame the battle this way, what does that mean for the role of the church in a society that's, filled with all kinds of different people and beliefs?